So I had a few questions come through on LinkedIn before we started. So I'll start with those. And then if any questions come through on the chat, I'll answer those. All right. So the first one I had was, I mentioned the hand raising on the previous video. And someone said, well, if I know the team, we've done a HAZOP before, should we use the hand raising or not? And my advice is when you do your introduction, introduce to everybody, make them prepared to be respectful of each other, and then also get them to practice the hand raising. And the reason for this is not because you've got a team and they might be disrespectful to each other, but some people might have an audio problem that they don't know about, and it arises during the meeting, and then you need to use the hand raising. And if at that point, when they've already got a problem and it's difficult for them to hear you or difficult for others to hear you over them, it'll then be difficult to put the hand raising in. Whereas if you do it when you've got control of the meeting at the beginning, you're doing the introduction, everybody can practice using it. And then if for any reason you have to put it in place, then everybody's ready and there's nothing to worry about. So I always make sure that during the introduction, I make sure everybody knows the ground rules for online meetings. Mute when you're not talking. Be respectful of others. If someone else is talking, don't unmute and try and talk over them. And don't use the video because for people with lower bandwidth, it can mean that they might not be able to see the screen, they might not be able to see each other, or they might not be able to hear us in live time. So, and then also then we practice the hand waving so that everybody comes back to me. The second question that I had was that perhaps if we pre-populate the sheets, it can become a sort of tick the box exercise with a HAZOP. Yes, of course, any HAZOP can become a tick the box exercise. I've had people say they've had HAZOP chairs pre-populate the whole spreadsheet, including cause, consequence, safeguards, and recommendations. And that definitely becomes a tick the box. Nobody else needs to be there, just the chair, making sure that everybody agrees, but nobody's going to disagree. That is definitely not the way to run a HAZOP. The way that I do it is pre-populating the flow guide words only for online meetings. And the reason I do that is it just takes a long time to type up all the tags, etc. So when you do that, you make sure that people actively engage in the cause, the consequence, and the safeguards. So even sometimes I don't think it's a credible cause, I make sure I put it in, you know, for example, if there's a potential for reverse flow from one system to another, and I know that the other system's at lower pressure than the system all the time, there's never a potential, I'll still put it as a cause if I'm pre-populating myself. I'm not going to make any decisions on behalf of the team, so that they can all come in, they can say, yes, Louise, I think that's a credible cause. No, I think you are making that one up. Definitely not a credible cause. And then we can go from there. Also, as I said, I don't pre-populate for any other guide words. We have still pressure, temperature, and then all the other sort of guide words like start up, shut down. Those ones none of those are pre-populated, and we will still go through each of those when we go through the HAZOP. So there's no chance of people doing like sort of a tick the box exercise. So those are the questions that I had come in before the session. I can give you some other tips on live HAZOPs or online HAZOPs if you want. But if anybody has any questions, I see there's a couple of people on the line, just type in the box. Otherwise, I'll carry on talking about other HAZOP tips. No? Okay, so another thing to do is to make sure that you have the documents ready before you start the session. So what I make sure I do is I have the HAZOP software ready with all the different nodes set out. And that's not meaning pre-populated. It just means the nodes are ready so that when we go from node 1 to node 2, it's already set. I also make sure that the company-specific risk matrix is in there. And that's regardless of whether we're risk ranking or not. Because sometimes you might come to a scenario and you might feel a bit uncomfortable about it. And want to raise a recommendation, but then it's got several safeguards and you're just not sure as a team. So then I just pull up the risk matrix and say, guys, you know, if you have this, if you have put this on the matrix, where you're going to be, do you need some additional safeguards? I have Dr. Ignatius on the line, and he has put a question. He said, after restrictions are lifted, will you prefer online HAZOP sessions or conventional HAZOP sessions? That's a good question. I really enjoy HAZOP sessions, and I like the people element of it. I think that when everybody's in the room, it works really well. However, even before the pandemic, I was doing online HAZOP sessions with the team in Iraq. So we had a video conference facility. Part of the team was in Dubai and the other part of the team was in Iraq. And that worked really well because the guys could go out on site and check things in between the HAZOP sessions, so that the next day they could come and say, hey, I checked that valve that you mentioned yesterday, and it's in this position, or we can't reach the handle or whatever. So that worked really well, rather than bringing the guys into Dubai away from site. And it's also sometimes not very practical for the HAZOP team to go to site because there could be restrictions on beds offshore, and also in countries like Iraq where you've got a camp. So it might not be practical to have the HAZOP team on site. So that worked really well. But again, as I said, I probably only do that by exception. If it was required for some reason, we would do the online ones. I also think the online ones might be quite good for the short HAZOPs. So I've done quite a lot of short HAZOPs on brownfield systems, like half-day ones or maybe 1 day. And those work really well online, because if you're only going to be there for 4 hours, you have to travel somewhere, and other people are traveling. So by the time you've traveled everywhere for 4-hour HAZOP, maybe you've already spent 8 hours that day. Whereas if you were all online, you can cut out all the travel, preparation, etc. So for brownfield small HAZOPs, I think online would still be preferred. For the longer HAZOPs, sort of the 1 to 2 week ones, definitely face-to-face, so that the team can build a good relationship with each other. And if for any reason there is a good reason to have remote ones, for example, with site restrictions, etc., then I would still consider the online ones. But first preference is face-to-face. Okay. So another tip is to make sure that you have the right drawings available. And so what I try to do is I engage with the process engineer at least 2 to 3 days before the HAZOP, once I've had a look through the drawings. And I asked them, I mean, for example, I did a HAZOP earlier this year, and some of the overpressure protection, I couldn't figure out the reason for the overpressure protection. I'm not trying to second guess the HAZOP, but I'm trying to make sure that I have a good understanding, and also that if I see anything obvious going to come up in the HAZOP, the process engineers are prepared. It might be an early part of the design. They might not be ready. You know, maybe they've just missed something. And rather than coming to the HAZOP session completely unprepared, making it look unprofessional, they can have a think about it. They're not changing the drawings, but they can have a think about it before they start their HAZOP session, so that they can a little bit more organized. Okay, yeah, that was a mistake, but we could do A, B, and C, and then we can discuss as a team the way forward so that we can raise a recommendation. Okay. Well, I'm going to stay online for another 5 to 10 minutes. If anybody has any questions, just ping them in the chat box. This is really just a trial, as this is the first live session. I wanted to check that the technology was working. Obviously, you can hear me. And we'll try another live session with a bit more engagement online beforehand, so that we have some more attendees. Okay, so another thing to check when you are preparing for a live session is to have a good engagement with your chair. If your chair doesn't ask you if you have a HAZOP procedure, that probably means that regardless of whether you give them one or not, they'll just do HAZOPs the way they've always done them, which might not meet your requirements. So have a good chat with the chair. If you have a HAZOP procedure, give it to them. Have a chat with them to understand whether they are going to be using them, whether they need any additional information to be able to comply. because that can be another problem. Perhaps you have quite a strict procedure, which is not what they're used to, and then they don't have the right documents to comply. If you're doing a HAZOP as a facilitator, always ask for the procedure, because the last thing you want to be doing is going through the HAZOP motions, and then the client says, this is not how we do it, we do this and this and this, and then it makes it look like you haven't been very well prepared. If sometimes it can be quite difficult to get the HAZOP procedure before the HAZOP, so I have had some problems with that. But if you persist, you always get the procedure, and even if you get it a bit late in the day, it's normally just a case of modifying your technique and maybe adding 1 or 2 columns on your spreadsheet to make sure that you record additional information. Another question I often get is, should you do risk ranking in the HAZOP? I don't like to do full risk ranking in the HAZOP, because the likelihood of risk ranking is done very well in the LOPA, but I do like to make sure that we do the consequence risk ranking. And the reason for this is not because I think we should make sure that we comply with risk matrix, but if you're looking at 4 different elements on a risk matrix, if you do the consequence risk ranking, it makes you actually think of each of the 4. It's like a little checkbox. So for example, if you have asset, people, environment, and reputation, if you're using the risk matrix, it makes you remember to document the risk for each of those 4. If you don't use the risk matrix, you can often just get hung up on the sort of the worst case, which might be people explosion, killing 2 to 3 people, and you go on about that. But you forget perhaps that if you have the loss of containment, the oil would also spill to the ground. Maybe it's not bunded, and then you could have potential leak to water, and so then you might also have an environmental consequence. And then you have obviously the reputational consequence if your facility is close to others, and in any case of shutting down won't be a good idea. And then the business consequence of having the fire. I mean, how far away are your units spaced? Are they quite close together? Are you going to have quite a high consequence? So that's a really good way of checking, using the risk matrix to make sure that you have documented the consequences for all of your different categories. So I always try and use the risk matrix just for consequence ranking, and then use your LOPA afterwards to put in the likelihood and to make sure that you have sufficient safeguards. And then also when you're doing the consequence ranking, you can start to get a feel, you know, we have a very high severity potential to kill more than 2 people, but we've only got 1 barrier and it's a procedural barrier. Then you'll be knowing that you need something more there, and it will prompt you to raise a recommendation. If you're not really going to the consequence without safeguards, which is often a mistake that teams make, then you might fill yourself with a false sense of security. For example, if you're going for overfull of a tank, for example, like we had in Buncefield, we had overfill of the tank with petrol, and it created a vapor cloud, explosion, etc. Well, if we just said, well, overfill of the tank, you say, well, it can't really happen because you've got a high level alarm, we've got high level trip, and then there's some other intertrip. It's not going to happen. So a high level will just result in trip of the feed. But that's not actually the worst case consequence. We have to think about the consequence without the safeguards, which is making sure that we think, okay, well, we don't have a level trip, we don't have a level alarm. If we overfill, is it possible? Can the source be more than the thing can take? Yes, it's possible. What will happen when it overfills? Is it going to go to the vapor line and then to a flare? Or is it going to go to an overfill line like it did in Buncefield? And then we can then start to explore the actual consequences. And if in Buncefield, if they had understood the actual consequences that were materialized, they would have put in additional safeguards, because they only had an alarm. And yeah, they only had an alarm. They never had a trip. So if they'd realized, hey, we have the potential of having a massive explosion, losing something like 16 tanks in a fire, well, then they might have put in a trip. They also might have put in some other measures in their procedure, so that they had additional supervision, etc. So I hope I've given you guys a couple of thoughts for online HAZOPs, and then also a couple of tips just in general for HAZOPing and how to make sure that you really assess the online consequences, or the actual consequences, rather than taking safeguards into account. I'm going to sign off now because I've checked that everything works, and I'm really glad some of you were able to join me. If you have any more comments, just post them under the video, and maybe in the next session I'll be able to answer your questions. Take care. Thanks.